Eddie Gross is a shareholder at Vedder Price in Washington, D.C.
So our panel is appropriately named, what's the name of the panel, Al? All right, Across the Pond. And so you'll be hearing perspectives this morning about how the market, this aircraft market is doing in the States and what are some of the reasons for where it currently is situated and where it's headed. So, I'm waiting for my panelists to sit down, and each of them is going to introduce themselves. They're going to say who they are, where they work, and there's a bonus point of information they're going to add at the end. Renee, you go first.
Great. I'm René Banglesdorf. I own Charlie Bravo Aviation, which is just north of Austin, Texas. And my bonus question is, in which election I voted first would be 1988, and I voted for George H. Bush.
I'm Johnny Foster. I own OGARAJETS in Atlanta, Georgia. We're a 38-year aircraft brokerage firm. And I, too, voted on the Bush Quayle side in 1988.
And I'm Brad Harris with Dallas Jet International out of Dallas, Texas. And our market segment is about 60% large cabin aircraft, about 30% mid and super mid-size cabin aircraft, and about 10% small cabin and king airs. And we are aircraft broker and dealer. And like Johnny and Renee, my first vote was in 1988, and George H. Bush as well.
I feel so old.
You are old.
I'm Jay Mesinger. I own a firm.
Was it Washington or Jefferson? Oh, sorry.
That would have been better than who I voted for, and I'm getting to that.
I did mention Carter, but go ahead.
I own a firm in Boulder, Colorado called Mesinger Jet Sales, family business, 44 years. I focus, like Brad does, probably 60% large cabin, and then the rest broken up between mid-size, super mid-size, and small. We do about 25% of our business every year in consulting for new acquisitions, which is really fun to see that that's becoming a solid number again and hadn't been for quite some time. I voted for Nixon, and that's because I think McGovern was the other choice in '72. And Johnny, you didn't put your socks on.
That's right.
Thank you, thank you.
I'm Ed Underwood. I'm president of Avsurance. We're an aviation insurance brokerage firm focusing on heavy jets primarily. I've been in the aviation insurance business 30 years. I first voted in 1972 for Richard Nixon. Okay. See? You're not the oldest guy, I don't think. You're a little older.
And I'm Ford Von Weise. I'm the head of aircraft finance for the Citi Private Bank. And I first voted in 1980 for Ronald Reagan, but at the exact same election, I also voted for a young guy for the mayor of Burlington, Vermont, by the name of Bernie Sanders. So for both sides of the political spectrum in one ballot box. It was very interesting.
Thank you. All right, so first segment, each of our panelists is going to express their sense of what the market sentiment is. Again, from their perspectives, and you can understand from the introductions that they're very different, so they should be useful. Renee?
Let's go first.
Oh, well, all right, you don't have to. Jay, you go first.
So it's across the pond. So of course what we're talking about is the we is North America. Are we leading or lagging right now? I think that's always interesting. And I think if we were bold enough, and probably should be, as Chad said yesterday so eloquently, we're dealing with half full, not half empty. We should begin to think of this as a recovery, and are we leading or lagging that? Frankly, I think North America leads that right now. And we haven't always, as proud as I'd like to be of North America, we haven't always led that. Actually, between 2002 and 2009, in the explosion of the emerging markets, we really saw our market share of new aircraft being manufactured not being delivered in the United States and being delivered around the world. But I think today we are leading as we come out of the downturn and into a recovery, but we are going to be closely followed by the rest of the market segments around the world.
Thank you. Renee?
Yeah, so most of my business is in the small and light jet market, and I think that we are probably leading in the U.S., leading a recovery in that market. We are seeing a tremendous number of first-time buyers, and we're also seeing a fair number of people who are upgrading their aircraft instead of upgrading their avionics to ADS-B compliance.
Thank you. Ford?
As you know, I have a role that's both international and domestic in aircraft finance within the bank and the senior management of the private banks based here in London. And the one reality that's become very stark to me is the perception of business aviation in Europe and the UK is its biggest problem. You know, people here, within even senior people within Citibank, view business aircraft as toys for rich boys and nothing more, like a yacht. And I don't think that culturally Europeans understand the utility of aircraft to which North Americans do. And that has a huge impact on the economics and the economic impact of the industry. So in North America, when the industry recently had a big tax break, and we'll get into that in a moment, it wasn't considered a giveaway to the rich guys, but rather a way to stimulate employment and to stimulate a great export. The UK is a country that has a very core and a very robust aviation segment. It's a huge export here. And unfortunately, the government policy sometimes damps that down by, you know, viewing this product here in Europe as something that, well, it's a rich boy toy. And the connotations with that are actually very visceral and very deep. So it becomes a very unpopular pastime here is how they view it. So when you read the Times, you read the Telegraph, or particularly the Guardian, the derogatory comments they make about business aviation are substantial, and it hurts this industry. Whereas in North America, now that we've got a different administration in place, not to say I support it, but the perspective on aviation has been much more accommodative and even promotional. And that has helped, in my opinion, at least we're seeing a recovery in North America. And ironically, we're also seeing a recovery globally elsewhere, not as strong here as it is we're seeing in other regions. But I think if the policies and the perspective of business aviation here were different, the industry would be in better shape here, and that's just reality.
Wow. Okay. Johnny?
One of the points that we're noting in the recovery, and I want to expand on something that Brian Proctor mentioned yesterday, was that quality aircraft in particular are selling. And Brian had mentioned that if you wait to buy an aircraft, it will become more expensive. And I don't know that that's exactly the true translation. What is happening now is that the quality aircraft are selling very quickly. If you wait, that plane will already be sold. When a new quality aircraft comes on the market, it will be the first to sell. And as a natural byproduct of it, what we're seeing in certain segments already is that the less desirable, lower quality pedigrees that we don't necessarily want to look at for our clients are the only things remaining. And so you're relegated to buy less aircraft for seemingly more money. As an example, we have a Gulfstream 650 ER for sale right now. The market has been a little bit slow, but the supply is to the point over the last month that we now have, in the last 2 weeks, we've received 6 offers to buy the aircraft. 2 brokers representing different buyers are in this room now. So we're in that same circumstance now where there's just nothing left in the quality, and so the competition for the good aircraft has really heated up very quickly.
Thank you. Brad?
Well, I'll tell you, with market sentiment, the market is very good now. I will tell you, to what Brian's point was yesterday, we saw the market basically in October of 16 is when we saw the market turn. And so when we talk about, and I don't want to get into forecasts, but when you talk about where we are on the market, it didn't start today. It didn't start 6 months ago. It started 15, 16 months ago. But with current market sentiment, what we're seeing is a very healthy amount of inquiries, which turned into transactions, the stock market, the economy, you know, quarter after quarter GDP growth and customer confidence has made the U.S. corporate aviation thrive, and it's been really impactful to see the amount of transactions that are going on today and have been going on for some time.
So general consensus, things are good, right?
Yes.
And we can attribute some of that to the change in policies that have been brought on by the new administration over the past year.
Correct.
Agreed? All right. So what U.S.-centric dynamics have impacted the corporate jet market the most? Let's see. Who wants to talk about changes in tax law? Would that be Brad?
So I'll try to explain. Most of you guys are not from North America, so the majority's not. So what I want to do is just take a second or a few minutes, not minutes, but talk about the depreciation and how that works. I'm not a tax consultant. I don't profess to be one, and if you need tax help, hire a consultant. But I'll tell you, in America, you can an aircraft you can depreciate over a 5-year maker schedule, which is over 5 years you depreciate 100%. You can depreciate, and that's for Part 91 private operation. For commercial operation, FAR Part 135, you can depreciate that asset from 100% to 0 in 7 years. With the new tax law, 2001, the government passed to where you could do 100% bonus depreciation. So you could depreciate an asset, 50% in 2001. 2006, they changed it for a new aircraft. You could depreciate that asset 100%. But you could not depreciate that asset on a pre-owned aircraft. So the new tax cut says you can expense pre-owned aircraft in year one and a new aircraft in year one. So as a buyer, depending on your tax situation, do you want to depreciate 100% of the aircraft in 5 years, 7 years, year one? And we have another, in the tax law, they took what they call a Section 179. It's a provision for a business to where you can depreciate $500,000 of that asset year one. They've taken that to $1 million. So basically, 4 things I'll talk about is 1, 100% expensing. Section 179 of the law would say if you're buying a $2 million airplane and you didn't want to depreciate $2 million over the first year, you could depreciate $1 million through Section 179, depreciate the other $1 million over a 5 or a 7-year period. Or you could depreciate that over 100% year one. So there's a lot of different things coming out of the new tax cut in addition to 100% expensing on new and pre-owned. And then thirdly, they've taken the ability to deduct entertainment expense. So if a corporation in the United States flies to the Super Bowl or flies to a World Series game or flies to an entertainment venue, they can no longer
Because
take that
aircraft
to
are a tool, right?
Correct,
Yeah,
yeah.
sorry.
No, for sure. It's a business tool.
Sorry, go ahead.
So, but I will tell you, one thing that I wanted to say is a lot of people don't understand that if you buy an aircraft, you can expense 100%, but also in that year, if you own an aircraft and you do $1.5 million worth of paint and interior avionics upgrades, 2020 mandates, that's expensable at 100%. A lot of people don't know that in North America. So, and the fourth thing is they've taken away the 1031 like-kind exchange, which allows you to buy a $10 million airplane, depreciate it over 5 years. If you sell it for 5, you have to recapture the tax that you've deducted. So now they've taken that away. So year one, let's say you've taken an aircraft, purchased it 5 years ago, you depreciated it to 0, you sell it for $5 million, you have to recapture that $5 million. But if you buy a $5 million airplane now, you can expense $5 million year one, so you don't owe that tax. It's very complicated, but in a nutshell, that's really what it is.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the economic benefits of buying an aircraft are much greater today than they were before
Correct.
the changes in tax policy. And those benefits go to whether you're buying the aircraft or let's say you're going to lease the aircraft. Whoever the lessor is gets the benefit of those economics. And then the pricing, the leasing pricing is more favorable to the customer. So that's been very beneficial. What about regulatory policies and the impact they've had on our market?
Well, I think that's really interesting. Brian talked about yesterday, and Brad just mentioned that we started to see some things happen in the fourth quarter of 2016, which coincided with our presidential election. And one of the things on which the president ran was shrinking the government in DC. And so I think if any of you want to be entertained and stay up very late tonight and watch the State of the Union address, you'll hear him say that for every one regulation that his agencies have created, 22 have been taken away. And so that deregulation across all the different governmental agencies, I think, is what we've seen stimulate the economy, because smaller businesses, which drive our economy in the US, really benefit from fewer regulations. There are some other things going on in the regulatory environment as well. One passed in October, in which President Trump and Secretary Chow, who's the transportation secretary, have put together a program to do testing in a number of different states and local environments of unmanned aerial vehicles, so that we can figure out how to regulate that airspace safely when drones move into bigger jobs in our economy. So we'll see some innovation being allowed there because of the policies that he's passed or put into place there. And then I think the third thing that we're going to see this year, which could be impactful to a number of people in this room, especially OEMs, is that along the lines of this deregulation, we're still looking at an FAA reauthorization. So if we see the same theme of loosening regulations, I think we'll see new products come to market faster, which, of course, innovation always helps our market.
Thank you. Johnny's going to talk about some cultural changes among the brokers.
I don't know that it's all just brokers, but the trend was hit on yesterday about ideas and concepts around standardization, and I think that will be an ongoing trend. It has been a topic of discussion at least probably the last 4 or 5 CJIs. Brian had mentioned there's some significant initiatives being played out within NARA and NBAA. There are multiple blogs and articles that most of us have had the opportunity to read, but the underlying message is that the industry has reached a point of maturity now where it is crying out for some levels of standardization and ethical behaviors. The challenge for the industry, now that we've reached 40, 50 years of maturity with a great fragmented segments here, is finding out a way to enforce these new regulations and standards, whether it's done through some form of licensing, who are going to be the policy holders that enforce the behaviors of whether it's brokers or attorneys. Are we going to look at different types of fixed fee structures and structures that may apply uniformly across the wide swath of the industry, or if it's just going to be each of our individual particular industries, such as brokers and attorneys and so forth, still doing their own thing. My sense is that the industry as a whole is crying out for some level of standardization.
Hopefully the standardization won't be no socks during the winter, but it's okay. All right, so let's talk about how we can mention also about new participants in the industry very quickly, about how that's raised the profile. Do you want to mention that?
Me?
Yeah, sure. Because you were the one who brought it up.
I did bring it
Yes,
up.
yes.
I think it's really interesting. I have a marketing background, and I love watching this. But there are a lot of new entrants, especially in the charter space. I think we're going to hear from some of them today. We heard from some yesterday that are bringing more entrants into the marketplace. The more people that are using private aviation, the more people move up into aircraft ownership, the more we benefit.
Terrific, thanks. Ford, tell us whether multinationals bringing cash back to the States will or won't have an impact, or whether you think that's foreseeable at all.
Well, if you believe the headlines and some of the political rhetoric coming out of the Republican Party, this is the next coming. All of this cash is going to be onshored to the U.S. from primarily here in Europe. For example, Apple onshoring $254 billion in cash, and they'll pay a $37 billion tax bill. The reality is very different, though. The reality, if we take a look at the last time this happened, where there was a tax amnesty for onshoring profits, 90% of those of the onshore cash was used for one thing: share buybacks. Wasn't used for reinvestment. Now, if you believe the headlines, all these companies can make these huge reinvestments. They're actually just investing a tiny amount. They're stating that for the headlines, but it doesn't matter because it's all about perception. The fact is, if the average consumer thinks that all this cash is coming back onshore to be invested, they're going to believe the economy's doing well. It's an economy, fundamentally, at the end of the day, is all about everybody's confidence that they're going to continue to do well. And it's essentially a perception issue, and it's good for that perception to everybody to believe this cash is coming onshore. So the net is very positive, and it will also help continue to boost share prices. So at the end of the day, I think this industry will benefit very well from it, but for a different reason than what people think.
Okay, we're going to switch it up a little bit. Jay, you were making us feel, let's say, somewhat wary of game changers, right? That could occur. That could, all this terrific good news about the U.S. and about our particular market, it's great. However,
Well, if you believe we are leading, not lagging, so much of what could happen could affect us first, and if something affects us, it'll trickle down. We had a great session yesterday morning about risk management. And if you looked at that risk management, you saw 5 items that were foremost in risk managers' minds for change this year in 2018. You know, I always find that there's a difference between distractions among customers and game changers. And distractions are those things that keep somebody that really isn't ready, but is looking for an opportunity to excuse themselves off the playing field and sit on the fence. I said years ago, I'd really like to be in the fence building supply business, so at least when they're sitting on the fence, I could make a sale. I didn't have to wait for an airplane to be sold. But there's a real difference between distractions. Distractions are those things like presidential elections or things that happen that can give someone that's really not ready an excuse to stay on the fence. Game changers are very different. Game changers are the risks that they brought up yesterday. Some geopolitical major event in the world, North Korea, cyber attacks, things that really can change the game. And when the game changes and people really stop, it changes our industry, and it probably changes our industry first. So we've got to be very careful that we're paying attention and that we're insightful and we're watching those things that could be game changers, because that's where our industry could slow down. And we talk, you know, the question is what U.S.-centric dynamics. They're going to be global dynamics, but since we are leading in doing the lion's share of the transactions now, the greatest number of transactions could stop overnight. We're in a tenuous recovery. It's a brilliant recovery, and we should embrace it, we should enjoy it, we should take advantage of it every day, we should guide our clients correctly, but we should also be smart enough to know that we've never been in a time that it could change so dramatically so quickly. One other thing I'd like to say, though, as you talk about new entrants coming in, one of the nice things that I see, and I know we're all enjoying it, because every time there's a transaction, I'm on one side of it, and there's another one of me on the other side. First-time buyers. And we're getting a tremendous number of first-time buyers coming back into the market. And that says a lot about the kind of confidence someone has. Because when you don't have confidence in a market and you're not an aircraft owner, there'd be no reason to get in. They only start to get in when they begin to have confidence. So we should all embrace that and enjoy it.
Ed, is there something that you want to offer up as being impactful that either we haven't heard yet or you know, echoing something else somebody else has said?
The overall health of the economy has helped things with the insurance business. Never seen more capacity to write business jets. You can pretty much write $1 billion limit on a global for $16,000 of liability premium, 4 cent, 5 cent, 6 cent all rates. So that's not restricting the market at all. Years ago, their insurance was an issue. It's not now. So it's a positive thing, and it's been that way for a couple of years.
I'll contribute a little bit to this besides my snarky comments. One thing that Ford said when he was talking about sentiment was he was talking about differing perspectives and about the cultural perspective regarding corporate aircraft here versus corporate aircraft in the States. I will say that, you know, the politics can't be removed from corporate aircraft in the States either. There's still this class warfare notion. And so over the past year, there were 4 or 5 articles in the Boston Globe, the New York Times, and some other publications, you know, where there was some sniping at business aviation, and in some cases, very focused on non-citizenship trusts. And that could be problematic for lots of folks in the audience, whether you're in the States or elsewhere. Lots of folks rely on non-citizenship trusts to have their aircraft registered at the Federal Aviation Registry. And what I would say is, you know, I'm part of an advocacy group who's dealing with it, and it was surprising to us to find out that the Homeland Security Administration is now looking into non-citizenship trusts. And they're thinking about ways in which, you know, essentially there'd be more intrusive information gathering and information requirements to create a non-citizenship trust. So, you know, although it is a business tool, you know, there is that perspective, and it's benefited our industry, you know, both at the regulatory level and legislative level. You know, there is always that concern. Okay. Forecast, lightning forecast. Ford, go first.
Yeah, 2019 is going to be the year of the pilot, or the lack of pilots and aviation maintenance technicians and engineers. This is a problem, by the way, that people, frankly, don't take seriously enough right now, and they should. You know, for years, people were talking about the pilot shortage, and everybody said, yeah, show me. You know, it was about 7 years ago when the chief pilot for American Airlines, I sat there and said to him, yeah, how about the upcoming pilot shortage? He said, what pilot shortage? I got a stack of CVs on my desk a mile high. Well, here we are. He has no stack of CVs a mile high anymore. You know, last week, Horizon Air offered a $40,000 signing bonus to start training, and they'll help pay for it. It's much more of the European model now in the U.S. But this is going to be a huge issue, not only for the airlines, and the airlines will, you know, most likely being the top of the food chain, suck up pilots from the regionals, but will have a big impact on some of the charter providers and the smaller aircraft operators. Its impact, we don't know what it's going to be, but it will be significant. There will be some people who will buy airplanes and will sit there and say, how am I going to fly it? And we, as an industry, have to figure out ways to address this more systemically than it's being addressed today.
Thank you, Ford. John?
I want to echo what Ford is saying there. Similar to my comment on inventory, we're beginning to already see this both on the pilot side as well as the mechanic or technician side in the States. As the supply of qualified candidates depletes, you're going to end up paying more for less quality. And that same thing happens here in personnel, and we're seeing it heavily with pilots, where we're seeing an increase in requested salaries for pilot positions in corporate aviation at premiums of 50 to 70% of what they were 2 years ago, for guys that have a fraction of the quality of the interviewers that we were putting into flight departments at that same time.
Thank you. Renee?
That's why my daughter's in flight school.
Right.
Great career. I'm very bullish on the market. I think that a lot of small companies, first-time buyers, buying aircraft is going to open up and cause small and mid-sized companies to grow at a more rapid pace than they've been able to before, and I think we'll continue to see growth for the next few years.
Thank you. Jay?
You know, I had a very, very bright, lovely client say to me about a month ago that he thought that the world economy was going to be extremely strong in 2018. And you know, that's the first time that he or several others have started to articulate an optimism about the global economy. These are not aviation people. These are great customers. And I think that's important. And you know, one of the things that's happened with our inventory is, though we've had a large amount of inventory, a small amount of that is in the United States and North America, and the rest is in other parts of the world. And we're always reluctant to try to import a plane in. First, we take advantage of what we have in our own country. But when the other countries begin to grow and prosper, they're going to start to buy their own inventory, be more comfortable with it, and we're going to really see a shrinkage in the inventory levels. And that's when residual loss rates will really begin to slow, and you can depend on it. It's a declining asset. They'll always go down. But I think the global world economy growing in 2018 is going to change dramatically how our industry looks at inventory, because for years that inventory has been sitting there and not being sold unless it was imported in. Now it's going to be sold at home.
Thanks. Brad, if you can give your forecast, but don't use the word shrinkage.
No, sorry, I'm not about shrinkage.
Make it sad.
So I'll tell you, we're bullish. And like Jay said, you know, the U.S. market has been good, and the economy's good, the stock market's good, and now we're starting to read about Europe and flight hours increasing and quarter after quarter, and you know, and that's encouraging to me to see the world economy come back. When we were in 2007, you know, I was talking to some guys at Gulfstream, and for the first time, 50% of their new aircraft deliveries were international, and it was a wow moment. And then we see how it's redacted back to where it's North America leading, and it's going to be encouraging to see, not only from the OEM perspective, but from the pre-owned market, to where the world gets back involved, where North America's been leading for the last several years. And I'll differ a little from Jay. I think aircraft in Europe, and Europe proper, are very well equipped. A lot of times better equipped than a U.S. aircraft. The regulations are stricter over here. And we actually look for inventory for our clients, not only in North America. It's I won't say it's easier, but it really is easier to buy a domestic airplane. But we have no problem coming to Europe and other parts of the world to buy good inventory. And it's encouraging to see the economy start to grow outside of North America.
The only thing I would add is, you know, we've heard all of these very benevolent points of view that are attached to political circumstances. And political circumstances in my lifetime have never been this extraordinary. And so we have midterm elections coming up, and there could be changes politically in the U.S. over the next 4 years where some of these industry favorable political circumstances might change. So it'll be interesting to watch, and hopefully things will continue to do well. Okay, questions? Questions? Where would that fit? Okay. Does the industry face a pilot shortage?
Yes.
Yeah, right, I think we've heard
Yes.
that.
It's real. It's a real deal.
Don't you think the difference in perception of business aviation in Europe and the U.S. is linked to the necessity of traveling certain geographic distances? I agree. I mean, I think that there's a reason for there being differences, but I think that's one of them.
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to ask this first of Ford and most of the panel. At Ford,
There you are. I couldn't see you behind there.
I'd like to ask Ford to wear his Citi hat and his hat. Don't you think the world would be better off if we published transaction prices, so what aircraft are selling at across the board, similar to what real estate does? And I'd like to ask panelists, and the last question, Eddie, did you vote for Lord Trump in the last election?
Look at the stoic reaction.
It's not about me. I was the only one, like when everybody was mentioning which president they voted for the very first time I said Carter. You didn't hear nothing? Anyway, so I'm ignoring the question. But.
So I think yesterday some of the presentations that were given about, standardization in the industry were spot on, particularly about transparency. You know, if you're going to put your regulator or risk hat on, understanding where transactions have traded, what the marks are, is terribly important and gives us as, particularly financial people in the industry, a tremendous amount more credibility within the banking world and within the regulatory world to say what we're doing is based on real data. Right now, we have to explain how we get our values, where we get our information, and there's always a little bit of, with the regulator looking at us, well, is that the real number or not? So anything that can increase transparency, that we can see the marks, will only help the financial side of this industry support the sales of aircraft more so than today. There's no question about it.
Can I add something to that? I think a really interesting thing is happening on the reporting side of our business. We're used to seeing VREF and Aircraft Blue Book, and those are our two resources, and we've learned to live with them and learned to live with what they have and what they don't have. But frankly, what I'm starting to see are greater number of independent, smaller reporting groups, either led by individual reports that brokers put out or collaboration of appraisers put out. And I really think what we're going to start to see, which is going to get us closer to the facts of our industry, are not the big reporting books having that kind of information, but the smaller independent groups that have a great tap-in resource to a certain segment of the rest of the market that's getting clearer, more accurate information. And so pay attention to the reports that the different brokers put out each month. Many of them do, and I think that they're beginning to be more accurate in their reporting than some of the bigger publications.
One of the Slido questions, based on the deal flow you see, do you feel that corporate flight departments will grow or shrink? What's that word again? In the U.S., and will more follow GE's lead?
I just go to make one quick comment. The question's a little misleading because people will sit there and say, GE getting rid of their airplanes is prima facie evidence that business aviation is bad. It's bad for publicly held companies, bad for the shareholders. What people don't understand in a broader context is that GE's profits are way down. Their share price is way down in a market that's been way up. GE has been dramatically underperforming on an operational as well as valuation basis that the sharks are circling, and when sharks are circling a company, business aviation is always at risk. This is not an indictment of business aviation, it's an indictment of bad management. That's what people need to understand.
Well, I would say that flight departments are what we're seeing is flight departments are growing. One thing that I was speaking to a colleague yesterday is we're seeing in Europe you see a lot of management companies managing flight departments and managing aircraft. In North America it's not quite so, but we're seeing a trend to where more and more flight departments are going to an EJM or they're going to Jet Aviation for management or other professional management companies, which is a trend that, you know, is I think coming from Europe and the rest of the world back to North America. But we sat down with a Fortune 50 company Friday 2 weeks ago, and they're going from, in 08, they were a 5-year turnover, and it was about depreciation. They've switched that to 7 years, and now they're looking to go back to a 3 to 5 year fleet turnover. And I think part of it's the new tax depreciations, but I think a lot of it's still transitioning back as the economy gets back good to stay in within that warranty period. But I would tell you that flight departments are continuing to grow in the U.S.
And don't forget to think of it on a churn rate basis, because as we talk about first-time buyers coming in, I bought an airplane from a 35-year-old flight department that was closing recently, but I took that airplane and sold it to a first-time buyer. So really, it's just change and evolution, and whether or not it's activist shareholders or whether or not it's poor earnings that cause something to slow, something's coming, so they're renewing. So our industry isn't probably losing at the end, it's just shifting.
Thank you. If we have time for more Slido? Okay. Oh, sure.
Just wanted to thank you because one of the things, so we talk pilots all the time from a shortage, but you both mentioned aviation technicians. So I'll tell you as a person that stands in front of young kids in college and that talks about our business aviation, what we do, and for everybody that's in this room, if you want to make a difference and you want to go out and actually do something, you're going to have to get in front of these college kids and before and talk about business aviation and the opportunities we have. Somebody just put up on the screen that in addition to the shortage, we're missing aviation skills. When we meet these young people today, the soft skills, getting in front, looking people in the eye, shaking hands, confidence in what they do, the people that we get in front. So all of us in this room, like I said, if somebody gets in front of young kids and talks about business aviation and scholarships and maintenance and what we do, the only way that we're going to make a difference, the airlines are grabbing, the sharks are circling to your point, and they are going into these schools today and offering stuff that we in business aviation are not, and it's more attractive. So if you want the talent, and just like you're saying, the shortage is here and it's real, we're actually going to have to go out and do something about it ourselves. So thank you for bringing up the technician side of that, because that's another place that we have to have visibility.
That's good. Thank you very much for that. I like the third question. Who is the typical first-time aircraft buyer? Has there been a change versus previous years? Anybody?
Oh, I think it's a combination of one of two. It's either the high net worth individual or it is the small, medium business who has recognized and can now have the vision that if you can get out ahead of your competition and in front of your customer more often, you can actually add to your bottom line, and the business tool is the aircraft to do it with. The high net worth individual who may or may not be coming out of a shared program into full ownership, and in many cases attracted by the older aircraft that have entry level, although the cost of operation, you got to be careful, price is a one-time thing and cost is a lifetime thing, but people are being attracted and coming into aviation because they can get into an older airplane for $2 million, $5 million, $6 million that they couldn't have before. So I think it's from two sides. It's high net worth individual and it's small, medium businesses.
And I would be careful to look at the millennials coming up. What we have with Wheels Up, and we have these fractional owners, and we have the apps, and we have the Jet Smarters. All those guys are those customers are getting their feet wet with corporate business aviation, and you're seeing a lot of the first-time buyers coming out of those type of programs saying, I want a whole airplane because I have a need now. And I think we're seeing the charter customers. We had two calls in the last 4 days, new customers that are charter customers or fractional customers that want to go into whole aircraft ownership. So but I do think the millennials are coming up, and we need to think about ride sharing and what that's doing to our industry as it evolves into whole aircraft transactions and ownerships.
All right, I have a question actually for y'all. How do you look at the present circumstances we have, all of which seem very positive, and compare it to 2005? Right, so thinking about how we all felt in 2005 and how we feel right now, how's your confidence that things will sort out differently than it did back then?
I'd love to say that in 2005 we had crackpots walking in the door every day with some other crazy way that they were going to make a fortune with airplanes. The number of, oh yeah, you don't know what you're talking about. You guys, you old people, you're idiots. We're the new. We know what we're doing in 2005. Each one of those things failed. I don't see that. I don't see crackpots walking in the door, and that's what gives me the confidence that this time around we're going to see, until it gets to that level again. But for the foreseeable future, it's going to be pretty stable. It's a solid trend.
Well, I'd say in 05, people were paying premiums for aircraft. I mean, a 550, someone was paying $10 million over list price. Sean, you saw probably some of that going on, and I'll tell you that we're not there today. Prices have, for the last 10 years, have been declining, and now we're seeing a level off, and we're seeing a stabilization. We're at all-time stock market high. What happens if it corrects 15%? I mean, there's still a lot of volatility into this market, and so I would say 05 was great, 6, 7, 8. Through 8, we saw 07, the end of 07 it started. We didn't realize it in 08, then it really hit in 09. So, I think we're still on the rise for several years, but we have to watch out for game changers, and we have to watch out for blips in the economy and a correction in the stock market. There's still some things that we have to pay attention to.
Do you think there are lessons learned, though?
I do. I mean, I don't. The biggest thing is pricing has corrected. And we're not seeing premiums for new aircraft. We don't see positions. Positions were huge back then, where people were buying up positions, and the OEMs have tightened that to where you can't do that anymore. And I think it's helped our business.
I mean, what I saw were the banks were financing those premiums.
100%.
And today, banks finance credits, way more than they finance assets.
I think the biggest lesson learned, frankly, was by the OEMs in their production levels, setting them realistically, because they were unrealistic last time, and that's the other thing that gives me, comfort going forward.
In 05, we were in the middle of an interesting period that started in 01 or 02 and lasted till 08, and that was we had the greatest influx of new entrants into our industry ever during those years, and they actually, to your point about premiums, people came into our industry believing that their airplanes went up in value every year. And I think that today, we have a greater realization that airplanes are what they always were, depreciating assets that go down every year. And that's why we had such tremendous disappointment among that group that got in, that segment that got in during those years when they found out that their airplanes weren't worth what they paid for them, and they got in thinking they were going to be worth more the next year.
Still more time out? All right. If the panel feels the current positive upturn may not be sustainable in the long run, which you haven't necessarily heard, what should the industry do now to minimize future turbulence?
I don't think it's going to be the industry that causes it to go down. I think it's going to be some other significant external game changer.
Okay. Will Buy American apply to BizAv in the U.S.?
Oh, I just want to get back to the last one. I think the risk panel yesterday morning, I think answered that question. It's an exogenous outside variable that could, really create a ripple for us.
And I think you also heard some of the responses about how we're going to be smarter about aircraft values, looking into the future. I do think that's going to be an important discipline to maintain. So the Buy American thing, right? So is it going to be the case that we're looking more to American-made products in the BizAv market? I don't
think
right?
that applies.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, users of this particular asset like a particular asset. It doesn't matter where it's manufactured.
Yeah, there's still a tremendous amount of brand loyalty in this industry. Falcon guys are Falcon guys.
And we're going to cover the Brexit topic in another panel.
Right. Besides, you don't want a bunch of Americans talking about Brexit. Good? All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody.